the 10th of July 1943, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, was launched. It could not have come at a worse time for Adolf Hitler and the fortunes of Nazi Germany. Many hundreds of miles away in southern Russia, the German army was already 5 days into Operation Citadel, its huge offensive designed to draw the teeth of Soviet power in the east for the remainder of the coming year. Deeply embroiled amidst vast Soviet defences were the very panzer divisions that Hitler had earmarked for the Anglo-American landing in southern Europe, which had been expected ever since the fall of the Axis positions in Tunisia in early May. Hitler was overwhelmingly concerned to retain Italy in the war, although convinced that there were many among the senior ranks of his erstwhile ally who wished for nothing more than an end to war and peace with the Allies. It was to the Fallschirmjäger that Hitler turned to provide the rapid reinforcement of the limited German forces on the island, many Italian units already choosing to respond to the landings with little enthusiasm. Late on the 9th of July, Fallschirmjäger Regiment 3, which was based in southern France, had received its movement orders. Taking off from Avignon and staging through Naples, Ju-52s and Heinkel 111 bomber transports carried the paratroops down to Sicily. DFS 230 troop-carrying gliders were also used in the reinforcement. The formation deployed to this airfield in southern Italy are being towed by Dornier 17s, now obsolescent and relegated to such secondary roles. The Gotha 242 was most distinctive in appearance with its twin-boom design. It had entered service with the Luftwaffe in August 1941, and many were used on the Eastern Front for supply flights. The variant seen here is the earlier A model and can be recognised from the later B type by its use of a landing skid. The B variant introduced a tricycle landing gear that permitted easier recovery of the glider after landing. The 242 had a crew of 2 and could carry up to 21 fully equipped troops. It was the unique upswinging rear fuselage that allowed the 242 to carry heavier loads than a DFS 230. Here, an NSU Kettenkrad, a motorcycle half-track, is seen emerging from this particular 242. The Kettenkrad had been designed to be air-portable so as to provide the paratroops with their own special motorised vehicle. Flying low over the Straits of Messina to avoid interception by Allied fighters, the Junker 52s head for the drop zone in Sicily. The young paratroopers on board look tense. The paradrop begins. The second wave approaches the drop zone, although in this case the Paras jumped from Heinkel 111s. This bomber had been pressed into service as a transport following the terrible losses in 1941-42 among the Ju-52 fleet. In this role it could carry 16 Paras, more in fact than Tante-U. Clearly seen is the method employed by the Fallschirmjäger for carrying their weapons into battle. Although some jumped carrying their machine pistols or rifles, most placed these and heavier squad weapons like the MG-34 or 42 in the special weapons containers that were dropped separately. At Catania, the Fallschirmjäger found themselves in combat with their British counterparts. Heavy fighting went on until the 18th and 19th of July, when breakthroughs by the Allied forces made the German positions precarious. Support for the Fallschirmjäger is being provided by a battery of 17cm K-18 heavy guns. Prisoners from the Hermann Göring division were rounded up following the Allied breakthroughs of the 19th of July and the German decision to evacuate the island. Between the 3rd and 17th of August, the Germans began a round-the-clock evacuation of Sicily via the 3-mile-wide Straits of Messina. Troops still on the island, including the Fallschirmjäger, were ordered to delay the Allied advance for as long as possible to permit as many men and their equipment to be lifted off. On this occasion, Hitler did not demand of his men that they stand and fight, for he now needed as many German forces in Italy as possible. Beneath the protective umbrella provided by massed Luftwaffe light and heavy flak batteries mounted on the Italian side of the straits, the evacuation began using barges. Over the course of 2 weeks, the evacuation lifted off no fewer than 102,000 German and Italian troops from Sicily and brought them to the mainland. When General Patton finally captured Messina on the 17th, there were no German soldiers other than those already prisoners left on the island. Most of the Fallschirmjäger returned to Italy to fight another day. Political events in Italy in the next 3 months set in motion military responses from the Germans and the Allies. On July the 25th, even as fighting was raging in Sicily, Mussolini was removed from power. Although the Italian government did not immediately sue for peace, they did so on September the 3rd. Under the code name of Axis, German contingency plans for the occupation of Italy and the disarming of Italian troops on the mainland and the Balkans now moved into high gear. Streaming over the border into northern Italy from Austria came many German formations. Even if Hitler could not keep Italy in the war, he would fight in Italy to keep the conflict away from the borders of the Reich. It was now inevitable that Italy would become a major theatre of war. By 8 in the evening on the 8th of September, German officers had appeared at every headquarters of the Italian army in Italy, demanding either full cooperation with the German forces or unconditional surrender. In the event of no agreement, the Germans would fire on the Italians. The Germans had planned well in advance and proceeded to occupy all major centres in northern Italy. While many Italian units did surrender or were disarmed, the Germans were faced with considerable opposition. As part of the occupying force, Fallschirmjäger had been flown into Italy from their bases in France and found themselves fighting Italian troops to the north of Rome on September the 9th. Short rest in the fierce Italian sun, Para's guard disarmed and disuniformed Italian soldiers. Most of the Italian opposition neutralised, the Paras take whatever means of transport they can find and head south towards Rome. On the outskirts of the city, they stop at an official German government building to take refreshment before moving into Rome, which had been declared an open city. Fallschirmjäger patrolled the streets of Rome, along the Allies, now enemies, and a symbol of the occupying power. When Hitler asked the Italian government to hand over Mussolini, they refused and placed him under arrest at a secret location. Hitler chose SS Sturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, an Austrian, to find and rescue Mussolini. After a search, he tracked the Duce to a mountain hotel at the Gran Sasso, and the plan he hatched was daring, dangerous and very difficult. General Student made a point of wishing well the 20 Fallschirmjäger chosen to assist Skorzeny, who, in his plan, had rejected the notion of a frontal attack on the Gran Sasso. Access via the funicular railway made it impossible, and the Italians believed the mountain to be impregnable. So Skorzeny decided to employ a number of gliders to land on the small grass area near the hotel and exploit the element of surprise to overcome the large guards stationed there. The 20 Fallschirmjäger now joined the 50 SS men from Skorzeny's own special unit, and they then travelled on to the airfield at Practica de Mare. Awaiting them were 12 DFS 230 gliders and their HS-126 transport aircraft. The 12 fully loaded gliders departed the airfield at 12:30 hours on the 12th of September. There was no doubting on the part of the glider pilots that they were engaged in a very risky operation. Their approach to the landing site would be highly visible, and the grass area available for the 12 machines to put down on was very tight. It is small wonder that Student and his glider experts believed the whole scheme quite fanciful and told Scorzani exactly that. As the ground troops set out for the Gran Sasso, there must have been more than a few among them who, like Student, questioned the sanity of Scorzani's scheme. Already the timetable had been changed by virtue of the late arrival at the Practica di Mare airfield of the 12 DFS 230 gliders. They had been brought from the Fallschirmjäger base in southern France and planned to have been on the field and waiting in the early hours of the 12th of September. It had been Scorzani's intention to launch the assault at dawn, when the defenders would be totally unprepared for the German assault. Rather than lose 24 hours and risk the chance that their preparations had been detected, Scorzani decided to risk executing the whole affair in daylight. The Gran Sasso came into view, and having cast off their tow lines, they were soon corkscrewing down around the hotel in which Mussolini was being kept prisoner. Alighting their craft, they rushed towards the hotel, taking the inmates by complete surprise and securing a rapid surrender from the commander of the garrison. Within minutes, Mussolini was in Scorzani's hands. The ground forces now made their way up to the summit on the funicular railway. Scorzani escorted Mussolini from his prison and introduced him to other members of the assault team. Plans had been made for a fast getaway, Scorzani having ordered that a Fiesler Storch aircraft be flown onto the summit to fly the Duce out. The landing field needed to be cleared of rocks. The plane was heavy as it was carrying Mussolini, Scorzani and the pilot. With the engine running, 12 men clung to the Storch while it built up pitch. The takeoff was dramatic. The Storch now flew on to Rome. Mussolini was greeted on landing by General Student's ADC. As there was ongoing fighting around Rome, a decision was taken to get Mussolini out of Italy as soon as possible. A Heinkel 111 transport was called up, and soon Scorzani and the former Duce were flying on to Vienna. One day later, Mussolini boarded a Junkers 52, which took him to Rastenburg and the Wolfschanze, Hitler's East Prussian headquarters. The Führer was waiting at the airfield as the former Italian leader's aircraft came into view, and shortly after it had landed, strode up to Mussolini and warmly shook his hand. Only one German division was to hand when the Allies landed at Salerno to the south of Naples on September 9th. Kesselring, commander German forces southern Italy, had expected a landing to the north and had placed the bulk of his divisions there. As it was, the opposition put up by the Germans was enough to douse the heady optimism that the Allies would be in Naples just 5 days after the landings. The battle for the Salerno bridgehead was hard. For 4 days, the Germans assaulted the British and American positions, only to be turned back by Allied resolve and the firepower of the naval vessels lying offshore. Kesselring decided to cut his losses and withdraw his troops northward to fight another day. Although withdrawing, the Germans exerted a price from the advancing Allies as they broke free of the hills around Salerno. It wasn't until October the 5th, nearly a month after the landings, that Allied troops finally took Naples. Hopes that they would find a working port were dashed when the scale of German demolition became apparent. But by mobilizing a willing population, most wreckage was cleared in a week. By October 1st, southern Italy was in Allied hands. Allied air power became a major factor in the evolving Italian campaign. Although the Luftwaffe did operate, the principal defense for German forces came from large concentration of flak weapons. German strategy was to fight hard for the territory to the south of Rome. Kesselring was a master tactician and now drew on every advantage the Germans had to use the very difficult Italian terrain to slow down the Allies and cause as many casualties as possible. It did not allow the Allies to properly exploit their numerical advantage in armour and mobility. Winding roads and deep valleys, steep mountains and villages built of stone could all be turned into miniature fortresses. An occasional anti-tank gun placed here, an assault gun stationed there, could cause disproportionate losses on a much stronger enemy. The careful use of mines to create lines of defence was also a characteristic feature of the German approach. The weather also frequently played into German hands. Heavy rains could turn tracks into quagmires, and the cold in winter could cause real hardship. Into this equation were fed the Fallschirmjäger, who became past masters at this type of combat. They combined high mobility with boldness and tenacity, all military virtues that did much to aid the slow German retreat up the Italian peninsula. The tough old gut, as British troops referred to the Italian theatre, was without doubt made so by the fighting expertise of Student's paratroops. Nowhere was this more evident than in the bloody Battle of Cassino. History has not been kind to the monastery of Monte Cassino. It was unfortunate for the Benedictine order that the Great Rock occupies a strategic blocking position on the road to Rome. Any army waiting to reach the Eternal City must first take it. On 4 occasions before early 1944 it had been destroyed. Though the battle began in January 1944, it was not until February the 15th that it was bombed by the Allies. They mistakenly believed that the Germans had already occupied and fortified it. The failure of the Allied troops to follow up the bombing allowed the Fallschirmjäger to occupy the ruins and turn the site into a fortress. In the context of German strategy, the town of Monte Cassino was seen as the linchpin of the Gustav Line. In the lull between the bombing raid and artillery barrage, paratroops from the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division moved into the ruins. Field Marshal Kesselring charged Divisional Commander General Heydrich with defending the site. Over the course of the 3 distinct battles that were fought between the 17th of January and May the 11th, the Fallschirmjäger were not dislodged. The first offensive against Monte Cassino was a classic frontal assault, although it was hoped that Operation Neptune, the landing at Anzio, would make the Germans draw off forces to defend that position. Deployment of Allied forces saw the US Fifth Army take the centre, the French on its right, and the British on the left. The greatest progress was made by the French, who in consequence drew the bulk of the defending Germans to them, thereby suffering high losses in appalling weather. A French officer later described his experience. Battalions cling to the hillsides. Everywhere the enemy is counterattacking furiously. Men fall asleep under the shell fire in the midst of mines and bullets. Only their wounds make them wake up. They're killed almost before they realise it. The British forces managed to cross the swollen Garigliano River and established a bridgehead, but could get no further because of German resistance. In the centre, the US forces were badly roughed up, although they had managed to push up Mount Calvario, which lay to the immediate north of Cassino. The first battle ended on the 11th of February with high losses on both sides of the line. It was during the second battle that the monastery was bombed and the Fallschirmjäger moved into the ruins. The Allied effort was now made more difficult by these elite troops. General Mark Clark, commander of the US Fifth Army, watches Allied troops begin the Second Battle of Cassino. With hindsight, the bombing of the monastery was an error. It would seem the Allies did not learn from the bitter experience that bombing a monastery to pieces increased the ability of the Germans to defend by transforming the ruins into an impromptu fortress. From the ruins of the monastery, the Germans now began to conduct a ferocious defence. The Allies knew, however, that it could not in the end be defended if Mount Calvario was captured. It was to become the focus of vicious fighting. 20th of February saw the 2nd Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 3, with support from the 10th Company, given the task of defending the ruins of Cassino. They were therefore on hand when the Allies launched their second major effort to capture the monastery. Braving the heavy aerial bombardment, the formation prepared to await the Allied assault. Within the ruins were some 300 paratroopers and 5 army assault guns detached to serve with the paras. Prior to the Allied attack, an artillery barrage from 900 mass guns concentrated in the valley below let loose a rolling barrage that lasted for 130 minutes. In the constant turning over of the ruins, 160 men of the original 300 and 4 Stugs were buried. The commander of the 6th and 8th Companies, Oberleutnant Jamrowski, was buried for 12 hours before getting free. He then set to rebuilding the defence lines within the town and monastery in the face of incoming Allied troops. In the subsequent fighting, the left wing of his 8th Company fought to the last round. By the end of the day, he had succeeded in reconstituting the German lines and preventing an Allied advance. Throughout the course of the next few days, the Allies continued to launch attacks on the German positions, which came under great pressure, but they nevertheless held. Jamrowski was wounded on the 19th and evacuated from Cassino. He was awarded the Knight's Cross in June for his outstanding leadership. The use of Sturmgeschütz 3s amid the ruins of Cassino is testimony to the versatility and effectiveness of this armoured fighting vehicle. Originally designed for the purposes of infantry support, it had by 1943 emerged as a formidable tank killer. In the close country of Italy, its low silhouette allowed it to be effectively employed in the ambush role. The close proximity of the fighting in the ruins inevitably led to the taking of prisoners on both sides. Here, a number of British and Commonwealth troops had become POWs, courtesy of the Fallschirmjäger. Although Cassino did not provide the best terrain for tanks, the Allies did employ them in the region. The Luftwaffe provided the main anti-tank defence with their 88mm flak batteries. The 88mm gun was a formidable tank killer, and the Sherman, which was the principal Allied tank in the theatre, was highly vulnerable to it. German opinion of the Sherman was not complimentary, and its tendency to burn quickly once hit brought about its nickname, the Ronson Lighter. A number of Shermans litter the valley floor, which is itself pockmarked with shell holes. Artillery fire was employed by both sides in great quantities. Allied frustration was great in that the German defence of Cassino and successful defence of the Gustav Line prevented them from exploiting this superiority in mobility. Although paratroops tended to be equipped with the same weapons as the infantry in the German army, they also deployed their own specialised weaponry. Whilst the rifle was the standard K98K and the primary machine pistol the MP40, the Paras also deployed from mid-war onwards their own FG42. It was a modern design with many advanced features, including plastic butt, pistol grip and a bipod beneath the barrel to enable it to be used by its operator as a light machine gun. Due to the reduction in the size of the paratroop arm after Crete, it was not produced in large numbers but was valued by the paratroops. Heavier squad weapons included the MG34, but by the time of Cassino these had been mostly replaced by the formidable MG42. When the battle finally ended in May 1944, Cassino and the Gustav Line fell to a massive assault by the Allied forces. The ruins of the monastery were stormed by 50,000 men of the 11th Polish Corps. For 5 days they assaulted the German positions, with the enemy offering ferocious resistance. But on the 18th of May, as they girded themselves for yet another attack, it was noticed that the whole area had become extremely quiet. During the course of the night, the paratroops had abandoned the ruins, leaving behind only a few men too badly wounded to evacuate. Claims for casualties vary, but the Germans lost at least 20,000 men. Many bodies were buried under the rubble and never recovered. In the wake of the Allied capture of Cassino, German troops withdrew further up into Italy. The Fallschirmjäger were continually involved in fighting with the advancing Allied forces. This long sequence gives a good insight into the general conditions experienced by the troops at this time. Operating in conjunction with army formations, including panzer units, they fought many delaying actions. Combat has been engaged with British forces. Mortars cover the advance of German troops. They pass a number of destroyed and abandoned Sherman tanks. They take prisoners from an Indian division and British formation. This paratrooper is using an FG-42 machine gun. This Fallschirmjäger appreciates his own very good luck. With the Allies stalemated at Cassino, it was Winston Churchill who advocated outflanking the Gustav line by launching an amphibious landing within range of Rome so that a swift dash could be made to liberate the city. While Operation Shingle, as the Anzio landing was called, took place successfully, the hesitation of the Allied commander allowed the Germans to react. Part of Kesselring's rapid deployment of forces to seal off the landing area included the newly raised 4th Fallschirmjäger Division. This unit was involved in the fighting around Nettuno and Anzio for the whole period the bridgehead was in place. It was also joined later by the Fallschirmjäger Lehr Regiment, units from the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division and Italian paratroopers from the fascist Nembo Regiment. The fighting around Anzio was extremely hard. The lie of the land contributed significantly to the very unpleasant characteristics of the battlefield: marshy, wet, prone to fogs, all in all a very unhealthy environment. Germans emplaced many flak and artillery batteries around the Anzio bridgehead. Allied air power made its presence felt, and it was very strong. Many air bases lay in southern Italy and around Naples and were thus in close range to the Allied positions. Though the German Air Force made the occasional foray over the bridgehead, most defence of the ground forces had to be undertaken by the flak batteries. Major Hermann, commander of the Fallschirmjäger Lehr Regiment, is seen here. This formation was involved in a very vicious fight with a unit of US Rangers. One of the regiment's company commanders described the action. "We had no heavy weapons, only FG-42 submachine guns. We deployed to protect the counterattacks of our tanks, to check a force of Rangers who had thrust into the positions held by a neighbouring company. I launched a counterattack at one of their flanks, thus cutting off a large number of Americans from their unit. About 400 to 500 Americans fell into our hands. Others escaped and entrenched themselves in surrounding farms, but surrendered after an heroic stand. During this action I was shot twice, but kept on fighting until relieved by reinforcements." Amid all the turmoil of combat, time was still found for the presentation of medals. A unit of Fallschirmjäger are presented with iron crosses. By the 23rd of May, with the capture of Cassino and the breaching of the Gustav line, the Germans abandoned their positions and began their retreat to the north, leaving 20,000 men at Cisterna. 5 days after the capture of Cassino, the Allies began their advance on Rome. Threatened with an attack to his rear, Kesselring abandoned his positions at Anzio. On the evening of June the 4th, 2 days before D-Day in France, General Mark Clark drove his US Fifth Army into Rome to claim the credit for the liberation of the city. He was given an ecstatic welcome by the Romans.
In einer deutschen Fallschirmjägerschule.
France was used by the Luftwaffe for the purposes of training and rebuilding Fallschirmjäger units, especially those having incurred heavy losses in Russia. In this unique colour sequence, new and veteran paratroops, some wearing the cuff title denoting service in Crete, are seen undergoing training in southern France.
Fertig machen zum ersten Sprung.
Interest is the use of Italian SM-82 transports. Even before the Italian surrender, the Luftwaffe had taken these aircraft into service in an attempt to make good the very heavy losses in Ju-52s. Many of the troops seen training found themselves shortly after being sent to Italy or fighting among the hedgerows of Normandy.
Mann auf Mann tut bedenkenlos den Sprung in die Tiefe. Nach der Landung blitzschnell an die Waffen.
The Allied invasion of Europe, so long expected on either side of the Channel, finally took place on June the 6th, 1944. Hitler's hopes of defeating the Allied landings on the beaches proved illusory. Even though it would take some months for the Allied powers to defeat the German army of the West, victory was never in doubt, despite the effectiveness of the German defences in Normandy. US troops that landed in the Cherbourg Peninsula on D-Day were the first to encounter the Fallschirmjäger. In the months before the final Allied breakout, the Americans would come to respect the formidable fighting ability of the German paratroopers. General der Fallschirmtruppen Mendel, commander of the 2nd Fallschirm Corps, is seen here in discussion with Meyer von der Heydt, commander of 6th Fallschirm Regiment. Also present is SS Obersturmführer Werner Ostendorf, who was commander of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division Gotz von Berlichingen. This latter formation had only been formed in November 1943 and had been working up around the towns of Tours and Angers. They arrived in the line to the south of Saint-Lô and Carentan within a week of the Allied landings, where they served alongside von der Heydt's 6th Paratroop Regiment. In the film that follows, the very close working relationship between Luftwaffe paratroopers and Waffen-SS infantry is obvious. A company of the 13th Parachute Regiment of the 5th Parachute Division moves up to the line near the village of Champ-de-Losque. This particular formation lost its commanding officer on July the 15th, when Colonel Count von der Schulenburg was killed in action. Digging into the high hedgerows, a Panzerschreck team deployed to waylay approaching American armour. The film conveys extremely well both the height of the banks and the depth of the bocage country which the US forces had to slowly and expensively grind through. The British would also experience their share of frustration with the bocage countryside in their sector of the bridgehead. Stug 3s and 4s from Gotz von Berlichingen Assault Gun Battalion drive down a narrow lane in support of both Fallschirmjäger and SS troops. The Stug 4 was a rarer type than the 3. Stug 3, a heavily armed detachment of paratroops carrying a Panzerschreck stay close to the hedgerows for cover. By 1944, the standard heavy squad weapon in the Wehrmacht was the MG42. The very high rate of fire of this weapon produced a very distinctive sound that led Allied troops to refer to it as the buzzsaw. This infantryman carries a Panzerfaust, a one-shot anti-tank weapon. The hollow charged warhead enabled it to penetrate the armour of any Soviet or Allied tank. Through to July 18th, the US forces tried hard to break through the positions held by elements of 2nd Fallschirm Corps around the town of Saint-Lô. Other units from Fallschirmjäger Division 3 and elements of 5th Fallschirmjäger Division were also in the line contesting this sector. The paratroops held the line even though on the receiving end of extremely heavy artillery and air bombardment.
Stundenlang dauert das Trommelfeuer an, das unsere Männer vernichten soll. Amerikanische Sherman-Panzer brechen in ein von Infanteristen und Fallschirmjägern gehaltenes Dorf ein. Ein deutscher Kriegsberichter filmt den Panzereinbruch aus unmittelbarer Nähe. Nach rechts und links sind unsere Männer ausgewichen.
Through a gap, an American M4 Sherman tank can be seen passing a position held by paratroops. The Fallschirmjäger bring up their anti-tank weapons. These include a Panzerschreck. This fired a rocket shell with an 88mm caliber, which enabled it to penetrate the armour of the Sherman without much difficulty. Other paratroopers carry Panzerfausts.
Panzer noch vor Erreichen der Ortschaft in die Luft gejagt.
Fighting in the bocage was very hard and brutal, with little quarter being given on either side.
Amerikanischer Infanterie. Hat einen schwer verwundeten Amerikaner gefunden. Ihre Schützenlöcher sind schon geräumt. Aus den Büschen werden nach Gefangenen herausgeholt.
The sight of two destroyed British Cromwell tanks, one which is equipped with a 95mm howitzer for close support, testifies to the proximity of these paratroops to the British sector in Normandy. German paratroops bring in a number of American prisoners of war. Among those rounded up are US paratroopers. Even as the battle for Normandy was being fought, on the Eastern Front the Red Army was inflicting on the Wehrmacht its greatest defeat of the war. The destruction of Army Group Centre in the summer of 1944 had brought the Red Army to the Baltic states and the borders of East Prussia by the autumn. Fallschirmjäger were also in action in the east in this period. Serving alongside an assault gun detachment are a number of paratroopers, all of whom are heavily armed for anti-tank warfare and are carrying examples of the Panzer Faust and the Panzer Schreck. While the assault gun goes into action in the tank killing role, which had by this time become its forte, other troops stalk and defeat a number of T-34s using their anti-tank weapons. The effect of the Panzer Schreck is clearly seen here, the backblast being quite pronounced. Panzer Schreck and Panzer Faust could kill any Soviet tank, even the heavy JS-2. Fallschirmjäger continued fighting alongside regular army troops in Italy through to 1945. This sequence is particularly good for illustrating to great effect the use of anti-tank weapons. By this time, each German infantryman was well equipped for such a role, vital in the face of the abundance of Allied armour. By the end of 1944, German forces were defending the borders of the Reich. Many Fallschirmjäger units had been destroyed or surrendered in the Falaise pocket. The survivors were being reorganized and mainly placed in Kampfergruppen. Gazing out over a destroyed bridge on the Rhine is a Fallschirmjäger operating on the border with Holland. With the onset of winter, these paratroopers have adopted winter camouflage and are equipped for anti-tank warfare, being armed with Panzerfausts. group of destroyed US Army Sherman tanks stand abandoned and forlorn in the snow, victims of the Fallschirmjäger. The paratroopers involved in the fighting in the Eifel during the early winter of 1944-45 had to contend with strong US forces. By this date, infantry could rarely call on armoured support. In the months from October to December, the supply of armoured vehicles, such as assault guns, were restricted as Hitler ordered stocks built up for the offensive in the Ardennes. The last major action in which the Fallschirmjäger participated was the Ardennes offensive launched in December 1944. Operating as ground troops were the 3rd and 5th Fallschirmjäger divisions. The former was attached to the 1st SS Panzer Corps and fought in the Monsgau area and Malmedy, St. Vith and Boot-Gelbach. The latter, under the command of Oberst Heilmann, fought in the Vianden sector at Witz and Bastogne. In one of the classic late war images, Fallschirmjäger hitching a ride on a King Tiger. With the inevitable failure of Operation Wacht am Rhein, the fate of Nazi Germany was sealed from both the east and the west. The disintegration of the German military machine as the Allies advanced into Germany meant that it was no longer possible to talk about the Fallschirmjäger as a coherent military formation. It is known that small units of paratroops fought on to the bitter end. For example, elements of the Fallschirmjäger Regiment 1 were still operating in April 1945, but following the crossing of the Rhine and the Allied advance across Germany, the fate of most surviving paratroops was that of almost every German soldier, a prisoner of war. No more fitting tribute to the prowess of the Fallschirmjäger can be offered than those comments uttered by Field Marshal Alexander of Tunis. There are no other troops in the world who would defend their positions with the same tenacity and courage. These are bold and highly trained men, hardened through numerous engagements